Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you again for turning up this evening. For many of you, this is probably the fourth or the fifth presentation you'll listen to today. Maybe you're exhausted at this stage, if not outright punch drunk. This particular topic, who first sighted Antarctica, might sound like a real dry subject, but I'll do my best to try and make it as interesting for you as possible. Some of you might well say, who was the first who sighted Antarctica? Who cares? But believe you me, historians do care, because it matters on the record. Now, for those of you who didn't hear me yesterday, my name is Joe O'Farrell. I'm from Ireland, and I'm privileged to be on this ship for the fifth consecutive year. To those of you who may be wondering why I'm in a seated capacity, it's because I've developed a neurological problem that makes it very difficult for me to stand. But the people on the ship are very accommodating, and they have no difficulty whatsoever with me delivering my presentation in a seated capacity. I hope you feel the same. So that's enough of the introduction. Now to the subject. Just to show you how large the continent of Antarctica is in relation to where we are. We are just going to be in this little small pocket of it, and yet look at the entirety. It's more than the size of Australasia. It's more than twice the size of Europe. And it really is incredible to think that this was unsighted by humans only for the last 200 odd years. There's no other corner of the globe, of the planet, which remained unexplored, unseen, unsighted for that length of time. And yet it's amazing to think that up to 200 years ago, nobody had ever set sight on the continent of Antarctica. We'll be dealing with the years 1819, 1820. And before we go into the chief suspects as to who was the first to sight the continent, it's important just to explain that in the years after its discovery, there was frenetic activity on the continent of Antarctica. As this slide shows, there were from Britain, France, America, Ireland, Germany, there was frenetic activity on the continent once it was seen. The four claimants, or rather the three to be precise, that we'll be discussing this evening. James Cook, an Englishman in the late 1700s. You'll have heard Caroline, if you were here yesterday afternoon, you'll have heard her refer to the activities of James Cook. The three serious contenders. The first one with the rather splendid name of Fabian von Bellingshausen. He was an Estonian and Russian in 1819-21. Edward Mansfield was Anglo-Irish, 1820, and the American Nathaniel Palmer in 1820 and 1821. It should also be said that recorded history only records from the official logbooks. There's every possibility, in fact I would regard it almost as a certainty, that many of the whalers and the sealers from North America in the years before 1820 might well have cast their eyes on the continent of Antarctica. But such was the competitive strain that was involved in the whaling and sealing industry, that if a captain found a good rookery or a good seal colony or a good whale area, the last thing he did was broadcast it. Most times they did not even record it in the logbook. They kept the location to themselves so that their competitors could not cross the line into their territory. These are images from the time. You'll all be familiar with the stories of Moby Dick and the story of the Essex, etc. And I'm just using this for emphasis to say that the whalers from New Bedford and Nantucket in Massachusetts. Anybody here from Massachusetts? Anybody here from Connecticut? Particularly Stonington? Oh, well then you're in for a surprise. In those years, in the early 1800s, New Bedford, Nantucket, Stonington, all major whaling ports in New England, sent out over 800 ships for whaling and sealing. So that's why, on the balance of probability, there's every possibility that some of those ships and the captains of them would have set sight on the continent of Antarctica, but it was never recorded, and therefore it's unofficial. In the Antarctic, in those days, seal pelts in particular were highly prized in Europe and America, and the sealers who did come across the colonies and clubbed the seals to extinction became very rich men from that trade. Again, the chief money to be made was the oil from the whales, but more particularly the pelts from the fur seals. You'll have heard mention yesterday of Captain James Cook. He was the first to circumnavigate the continent of Antarctica, not realizing that he had circumnavigated the continent. He was there in 1775. He felt that there was a landmass within his circle of navigation, but he could never be certain. You'll also have heard Caroline yesterday refer to his withering comment on Antarctica, if it did exist. And for those at the back of the hall, I'm happy to break my own rule and read from a slide. These are lands doomed by nature to perpetual frigidness, never to feel the warmth of the sun's rays, whose horrid and savage aspects I have not words to describe. This is the area where Captain Cook was. Now, the first of our primary contenders for the first to set sight on the continent of Antarctica is the American Nathaniel Palmer. Born in Stonington in Connecticut, he was a very, very capable seaman at a very early age. He was 20 when he commanded his first ship in Antarctic waters for whaling and sealing. There's no known early portrait of Nathaniel Palmer as a young man, but this is a daguerreotype taken of him in 1872 when he was an elderly man. This is the rotation of his voyage in his ship, the Hero, in November 1820. And this is the area of Antarctica just off the Antarctic Peninsula, where we will be in a few days' time. This is the area where he did most of his sealing and whale work. He became very, very successful. He retired from seafaring at the age of only 30 and became very, very wealthy from the fur seal trade. Built this very fine house in Stonington in Connecticut, which is now a museum devoted to Nathaniel Palmer. If you study the house carefully, you'll see on the top of the roof, above the third floor, the equivalent of a little lookout. He spent most of his retired life in that, as if he was on the lookout of a ship. In the museum, there are numerous displays, numerous artifacts. This shows the length of activity that there was in that area. There's a plaque beside Palmer's voyages. The plaque is worth reading. And for those again at the back of the hall, routes taken by the early Antarctic explorer Nathaniel Palmer, also Fabian Bellingshausen and Edward Bransfield. All of their voyages came close to the mainland of Antarctica, but Palmer was the first to sight this new continent in November 1820. So the Americans firmly believe that the prize of being the first to see the continent of Antarctica rests with Nathaniel Palmer. You know that you've done something serious when the nation gives a postage stamp showing your image. What is extraordinary about this is, on the basis that there is no known early portrait, sketch, let alone a photograph or a daguerreotype of Nathaniel Palmer, where did the US postal authorities get this image? Nathaniel Palmer is buried here in this cemetery in Stonington, in Connecticut. I mentioned earlier on that he retired early from his sealing and whaling work, devoted a lot of his life to what was then the emerging new skill of designing clippers. The purpose of the clipper was that it was intended to be the fastest ship on the planet, devoted exclusively to the route from what is now Ceylon, what was then Serendip, with the first of the tea crop from this season. Ceylon and Indonesia were the first countries to produce tea for export to Europe and America. Those that carried the earliest crop in the season could be guaranteed to make a small fortune. This ship here is typical of the clipper that Palmer would have been involved in the designing. You'll notice it's a 5-master. It's also very, very low on the water, which meant that it was able to take the journey from what is now Sri Lanka to the New England coast in half the time that the traditional ships took, which is why he became a very, very wealthy man. The next contender is this man, Fabian von Bellingshausen. He was born in what is now modern Estonia. He joined the Royal Navy, the Russian Navy at a very early age. Again, worked his way up through the ranks and became a sea captain at the very early age of 24, which was almost unheard of in the Russian Navy at the time. This is a contemporaneous drawing of his 2 ships, the Vostok and the Mirny, that were sent out by the Tsar of Russia to check the southern waters in the expectation and in the hope that a continent existed, which, if Russia claimed it, would be an enormous boon to Russian international prestige. I'm indebted to my fellow presenter and good friend Bob Headland, who will be lecturing again over the coming days on Antarctic history. I'm indebted to him for this fascinating slide from the Antarctic Museum in Leningrad. It purports to be a page from von Bellingshausen's logbook, and if you'll exclude all the hieroglyphics on it, this little mass was written in the logbook as intended to be the first sighting of a landmass. Now, I'm no lawyer, but you would need to be very, very astute to be able to convince a jury in a court of law that that's a landmass. In fairness to Bellingshausen, he himself never ever claimed that it was a landmass. He felt it could have been an ice blink, a mirage, even a huge iceberg, but he never himself claimed it to be the continent of Antarctica. It was his fellow shipmates who added in the logbook that this was the continent of Antarctica. Also, what's interesting from the logbook of Bellingshausen is that this is the first recorded sketch or drawing of the Aurora Australis. This was taken on February the 3rd, 1820. The square at the top of the map of Antarctica shows where Bellingshausen was on that date in February 1820, when his shipmates claimed they were first to sight the continent of Antarctica. The authorities in Russia clearly are convinced that their man was the discoverer. This is a big notice in the museum in St. Petersburg in Russia, and it reads, Russian Antarctic expedition led by Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen and Mikhail Lazarev, discoverer of the continent of Antarctica. So again, they have nailed their colours to the mast. They firmly believe it because they erected this statue to von Bellingshausen in Kronstadt, and not unlike our good friend Palmer, The British this time issued a stamp claiming that he was deserving of recognition. Interestingly, the Russians didn't issue the stamp, it was the British. So that's von Bellinghausen's claim. And the third man to enter our story is Edward Bransfield, born around 1785. There's no record of his date of birth. The strange thing is there is no known portrait, sketch, certainly not a daguerreotype of Edward Bransfield. Nobody ever knows what he looks like, which is all the more surprising that this portrait of Edward Bransfield appeared in a 2021 book called the Antarctica Pennisula, an encyclopedia for the 21st century. There is no accreditation as to where the photograph came from, and you could look at it and look at it and look at it and say that could be General Custer before the Little Bighorn. It could be Bill Cody of Buffalo Bill fame. It could even be Mark Twain. But nobody knows if it actually is Edward Bransfield. As I mentioned, he was born around 1785 in County Cork in Ireland. Now, again, to add a little bit to the history without bamboozling you with dates and years, etc., Ireland as a country was subjugated by the English for practically 800 years, from 1179 up to 1922. Britain controlled Ireland and actually subjugated it, irrespective of the local tribes who fought the British during that entire period. Around the time of the Napoleonic Wars, the early 1800s, Britain needed to expand their navy, and they consequently needed to expand the number of officers and men who could serve the ships to fight Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars. They sent impressment teams all around Ireland, and I'm just checking the date, in 1803, at 18 years of age, Bransfield was outside Ballinacurra in County Cork fishing with his father when an English patrol boat logged up beside them, took 18-year-old Edward Bransfield ashore, took him to England, and that was the end of his Irish involvement. That happened quite a lot of the time. It's reckoned that of the nearly 750,000 men who were seconded to fight in the Napoleonic Wars on England's side, or what was then Great Britain, nearly a third of them were impressed in Ireland. So it was not unusual for Edward Bransfield to be impressed into the British Navy. But probably because he had a better quality of life in England than he would have had in the rarefied rural life in Ireland, he again rose up through the ranks. He became a captain at a very early stage, and he was appointed in 1817, after the Napoleonic Wars were finished. He was appointed as the Royal Navy's Pacific Commander in Valparaiso in Chile. So in 1817 he left England, took up his new post in Chile, and that's where his life took an unexpected and interesting turn. He wasn't by nature or by design intended to ever go to Antarctica, and the reason why he went there is rather convoluted. This is an image of an English ship called the Williams, which in February 1819 left England under the command of Captain William Smith, taking a cargo of timber from England to South America. As the ship approached Cape Horn, it encountered severe storms. Williams, with his ship, hove to for 2 or 3 days, hoping the storms would lessen. They didn't lessen, in fact they became more ferocious, and he then decided he had no choice but to divert south rather than risk his ship and his cargo in the storms off Cape Horn. Insurance was a fairly new concept at the time, and unlike now, every marine insurance policy in those days contained what was called an undue deviation clause. So if your logbook showed that the ship deviated from the course it had set down as it left its home port, in this case in England. If the logbook showed that it deviated from that, if anything subsequently happened to the ship or its cargo, the insurance became invalid. So therefore he did not enter anything in the logbook. And just as a little aside, to show how the world of insurance has moved on, now every marine insurance policy contains a provision that in the event of a calamity, you must engage in undue deviation in order to save the ship. The ship got back to Valparaiso eventually. Williams had instructed his crew, as I mentioned, he never mentioned in the log that he had diverted. He instructed his crew not to divulge to anybody the alternative route they had taken. As part of his divergence, he went down to what is now known as the Bransfield Strait and the South Shetland Islands. He saw land there. It was not on any chart, it was not on any map. He had no idea where he was, but he knew that he had sighted land. He instructed his crewmen not to make any mention when they got back to Valparaiso. But crewmen being crewmen, and probably after a few tots of rum, they spoke out of turn. Word got through to the British authorities in Valparaiso that a ship was alleged to have seen land south of Cape Horn. At that stage, Rear Admiral Otway, the overall command of the British in Valparaiso, instructed Bransfield to take command of the ship, the Williams, to sail with it, with the original captain, and asked the captain to secretly retrace his original routes. This is the route that was retraced, clearly in the South Shetland Islands. And as part of the instruction given to Bransfield, and it's a very interesting little document in the records, it shows how little was known or how little was thought to exist about the continent of Antarctica, if there was one. Bransfield was given the specific written instruction by Vice Admiral Otway. Again, I will read it for you for the purposes of emphasis. You will ascertain the natural resources for supporting a colony and maintaining a population, or if it be already inhabited, will minutely observe the character, the habits, the dresses and the customs of the inhabitants, to whom you will display every friendly disposition. Nobody knew what was down there. That's the instruction that was given to Bransfield. Again, a contemporaneous drawing of the location he was in. And just to keep things in perspective, this is the area that Bransfield was in, which is very, very similar to the area where we're going to be when we do spend our 5 days cruising on the Antarctic Peninsula. I mentioned that there's no known image of Bransfield, but the authorities produced a stamp showing the name of the ship, which was called the Edward Bransfield. Some years back, when I was down in that part of the Antarctic, this is taken from Livingston Island. You don't have to climb very, very far up one of the little hills on Livingston Island. Took this photograph, and if you look closely, you can see on the horizon what clearly is a landmass. Here's a second photograph that was taken of what is now called Mount Bransfield. It's the mountain on the left with this peak shrouded in cloud. That's called Mount Bransfield. Now, we move on slightly. I mentioned I'm Irish. On January the 23rd, 2020, which was the nearest date to the anniversary of January the 30th, 1820, an event was held in Ballinacurra, County Cork, Edward Bransfield's hometown, where a monument was being erected to Bransfield as the discoverer of Antarctica. The organisers, knowing that there was likely to be a dispute between the Irish and the Russians, invited the Russian ambassador to the celebration with the understanding that if the Russians held a similar event to celebrate their man, von Bellingshausen, a delegation from Ireland would go to Kronstadt. No reply was received from the Russian ambassador. This is the monument that was erected. It couldn't be a sculpture, it couldn't be a statue for the reasons that I mentioned earlier on, that nobody knew what Bransfield looked like. On the reverse of the monument is an engraving of the brig, the Williams, which was the ship in which Bransfield sailed down to categorically establish that the continent of Antarctica existed. So, who actually was the first to discover the existence of the Antarctic continent? Was it Nathaniel Palmer of America? Was it Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen of Estonia, now part of Russia? Or was it the faceless man Edward Bransfield, the Anglo-Irishman? I leave the final word to the British authorities. There was a situation in 1953 when the first shots were fired in anger on the continent of Antarctica. It occurred in one of the islands in the Bransfield Strait. The Argentine base fired some shots over the heads of the British who were at the nearby base on the basis that the British were encroaching on Argentine territory. They were the first shots ever to be fired in anger. As it transpires, there were no injuries, there was no altercation, there was no engagement. But 2 years later, to try and settle the issue, Britain took Argentina and Chile to the Court of Justice in The Hague in the Netherlands to try and get the dispute settled. Britain was claiming that they had priority over the area they were in. The Argentines and the Chileans disputed that and felt that Britain had no right to be in that particular corner. The main argument that Britain put forward was, and I quote from their testimony, in the application to the International Court of Justice in 1955 for settlement of its ongoing claims dispute with Argentina and Chile, Britain testified that Antarctica was, quote, first sighted, unquote, by Edward Bransfield on January the 30th, 1820. The situation was never resolved because, as happened then, and as still happens to this day, if in a court of law one or other of the sides feel that they're not likely to win, their best course of action is to refuse to acknowledge the court. So Argentina and Chile refused to acknowledge the existence of the Court of Justice in The Hague. That's where the situation ends. On the plaque, on the monument in Ireland, as I said, there is no known portrait of Edward Bransfield, but what is written on the monument is Edward Bransfield, 1785-1852, ship's master and Antarctic explorer from Ballinacurra, County Cork, Ireland, leader of the first expedition to see and chart the Antarctic mainland on the 30th of January 1820. So, we Irish, we don't like to boast too much, we don't like to blow our trumpet, but you can take it as read that we in Ireland regard our man, Edward Bransfield, as the first man to have set sight on the continent of Antarctica. And just to close with an existential question, and again this follows from Caroline's lovely talk yesterday where she drew the distinction between Antarctica and the Antarctic. Now everybody here will have spent serious money on this cruise to get to Antarctica, knowing that there's no landings possible or feasible. The rules state that any ship with more than 500 passengers can never deposit passengers on the continent of Antarctica. So as a result, there is no possibility whatsoever that any of us from this ship will be able to set foot on the continent. That simply means we cannot ever have it said that we've been to Antarctica, But we can have it said that we've been to the Antarctic, because the Antarctic is both the continent of Antarctica and the surrounding seas. So every one of us will be able to say, when we go home, we've been to the Antarctic. Thank you very much for your attention, ladies and gentlemen.